Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, the show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to what I think will be a riveting episode of the Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast, where today we delve deep into one of the most shocking and almost hilarious at times scandals to rock the U.S. Navy. I'm your host, Paul Vogelzang, and today's episode is brought to you by newspapers.com. And in this episode, we explore the book Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy, authored by our guest today, Craig Whitlock, who is an esteemed Washington Post journalist whose relentless investigation and research sheds light on a saga of corruption that seems straight out of a high-stakes thriller. In the tranquil waters of the Western Pacific, beneath the veneer of routine naval operations, a tempest of decadence and deceit was brewing. At the center of this storm was Leonard Glenn Francis, a charismatic defense contractor who earned the nickname Fat Leonard. His arsenal? Luxurious dinners, lavish parties, and an endless supply of bribes. From lobster thermidor to Osetra caviar and vintage champagnes, Leonard knew the price of everyone's silence. For over a decade, Leonard's influence ran deep, seducing high-ranking officers with the allure of opulence they seemingly couldn't refuse. In return, they turned a blind eye as Leonard Glenn Francis, Fat Leonard, overcharged and defrauded millions from U.S. taxpayers, all under the guise of servicing fleet necessities. But how did Fat Leonard weave such an intricate web of influence and corruption? And at what cost to the integrity of the U.S. Navy?
This is actually the very start of the book, the prologue, but I think it summarizes things pretty well with Leonard Francis and what a charismatic con man he is. And it actually describes how after he'd been arrested and pleaded guilty to bribery charges, he conned a federal judge and the Justice Department to letting him out of jail to get medical treatment. And he made them think he was dying. He was sick. He did have cancer, but he certainly wasn't dying. And he was able to, well, I don't want to give it away, so let me just read this passage. The dateline is San Diego, California in September of 2022. It shouldn't have been so easy for a morbidly obese 57-year-old felon with 2 bad knees and kidney cancer to escape federal detention and flee the country. But early Sunday on Labor Day weekend, while nobody was paying attention, Leonard Glenn Francis seized his chance. Having bought off his lone security guard, he cut off the GPS tracking device strapped around his ankle. He waddled outside and climbed into an Uber. About 20 minutes later, he arrived at the Mexican border crossing near Tijuana. By the time the U.S. Marshal Service and the San Diego police realized he was missing, he was on his way to Cuba. The fugitive wanted posters that appeared a few days later described Francis as an Asian man with black hair and brown eyes, standing well over 6 feet tall. But his most distinguishing features were his weight, 350 pounds, and his nickname, Fat Leonard. His crimes, bribing scores of military officers, bilking millions of dollars from defense contracts, and paralyzing the U.S. Navy in one of the worst public corruption scandals in American history.
That's our guest today, best-selling author Craig Whitlock, reading a passage from his new book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. So join us as Craig Whitlock takes us behind the scenes of his 10-year investigation, unraveling a complex narrative enriched by terabytes of leaked government data and a trail of greed that leads straight to the top. Today, we'll confront the hard truths about the vulnerabilities within our armed forces and ponder the price of unchecked entitlement and power. So prepare for a discussion that is as enlightening as it is unsettling, but at times absolutely hilarious as we ask tough questions of author Craig Whitlock, who gives us the straight answers about responsibility, reform, and the way forward for America's naval guardians. This is not just a story about one man's corruption. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when guardians become exploiters. So stay tuned as we navigate the the choppy waters of justice, accountability, and the arduous task of cleaning house in one of the nation's most respected institutions. Author Craig Whitlock, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I'm smiling here. I've got a copy of the book Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy by Craig Whitlock. I loved the book. I'm excited to talk to you. Congratulations on it. And I imagine you are very busy these days.
Well, thanks. I love talking about Fat Leonard in the Navy. It's one of those stories that you rarely come across in a long career in journalism. And I've always been fascinated by this character, Leonard Francis, and how he was able to do what he did. So I'm always happy to talk about it.
Well, thank you, because I loved the book. Let's get into it. So it was a little bit of happenstance that you came upon this story. Your jaw just must have my jaw dropped as I was reading all of this. And as you investigated it more and more, it probably captivated you just like it did me. And I know all of our audience and every reader out there. What grabbed you in that happenstance moment there at the Pentagon as you learned about this story with Fat Leonard?
So back in 2013, in September, October of 2013, I was a Pentagon beat reporter for the Washington Post. And there had been a brief news article come across the Associated Press newswire from San Diego that fall about how a defense contractor for the Navy named Leonard Francis had been arrested on bribery charges. There were two other defendants. One was a Navy officer who had been charged with taking bribes, and also a federal agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. Most people are familiar with the TV drama NCIS. Mm-hmm. So here you had a defense contractor charged with bribery, but unusually an officer, a uniformed officer charged with taking bribes, and an NCIS agent, a federal law enforcement agent. So this was different. This was unusual. It hadn't gotten much attention. I was kind of wandering the corridors of the Pentagon and bumped into a Navy officer I knew. And I said, "Do you know anything about this case? Who's this contractor, Leonard Francis? What does he do?" And the officer got a big smile on his face and said, "Oh, you mean Fat Leonard?" And my eyes got big. I said, "Oh, is that what he's really called, Fat Leonard? Is he well known?" And he goes, "Everybody in the Navy knows Fat Leonard." That's all it took to hook me on the story, right? I mean, you have bribery, you have federal law enforcement agents, an officer, and you have an alleged villain known as Fat Leonard. I can smell a good story like that. So I was hooked from that point forward.
Thank you for that. That's a great little intro to all of this. Well, what a piece of work Leonard Francis is. And I want to get into all of those things because he really is. He makes this story. The Navy is a huge part of it. I thought this was really interesting. A name from the past. I remember well, our audience will remember the name Aristotle Onassis. But Leonard Francis, actually, he wanted to be the Malaysian Aristotle Onassis. Did he make it? Did he get there?
He was pretty close. So just a little background on Leonard Francis. He ran a maritime services company that he essentially started from scratch, although his family had been in the business for a number of years in Southeast Asia along the Strait of Malacca and Malaysia and Singapore. But he started this business as a young man, and he started getting small military contracts to resupply or service foreign warships when they would stop for a port call or a few days of shore leave in Malaysia. And he would provide water, cigarettes, food, tugboats if they needed. And he got bigger and bigger over time. But as a young man, he had grown up on the island of Penang in Malaysia on the Strait of Malacca. And this was where most of the world's shipping traffic moved through the strait. And so he was accustomed from a young age at seeing these cargo ships and merchant vessels and even cruise ships like the Queen Elizabeth II come through his part of the world. And he was fascinated by all this. He also had a fascination with American culture. And so he did kind of style himself after Aristotle Onassis, who, of course, famously became married to Jackie Kennedy. And Leonard was a guy who liked glamour. He had a very big ego, and he did sort of dream about this openly of becoming the Malaysian Aristotle Onassis in terms of dominating his maritime services industry. And over time, he did do that in Asia.
Hi, it's Paul. I mentioned that today's episode is brought to you by our friends at newspapers.com. Check out newspapers.com, especially now because you can discover your dad in the paper when you search newspapers.com. Find the stories that make him who he is today by searching the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your dad grandpa, and anybody else in the papers. Search more than 945 million pages from major news titles to small town papers. Uncover birth and marriage announcements, obituaries, photos, and much, much more. Explore papers dating back to 1690. That's right, 1690. Or as recent as last month, newspapers.com is used by millions of people every month for genealogy. Our Not Old Better Show audience loves their genealogy work, and newspapers.com is an amazing resource for that, as well as for other historical research and much, much more. Find something you like with newspapers.com. It's a snap to save and share articles with family and friends, or attach them directly to your ancestry tree. You can do that all in newspapers.com with Ancestry. Use promo code NOTOLDBETTER for a 20% discount on your subscription. All of this will be in our show notes today, but that's code NOTOLDBETTER, and celebrate the stories of a lifetime with newspapers.com. Author Craig Whitlock is our guest today. Craig has written the wonderful new book titled Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. The book is fantastic. It's just getting already rave reviews. Craig, I loved what Kirkus Reviews says. They say a vigorous investigation into the life of a con artist and swindler who had half the leadership of the U.S. Navy in his pocket, maddening and astonishing in its revelations of a crime spree that cost taxpayers untold millions. Just a fantastic book. I want to recommend it so highly to our audience, but so many others are recommending this too. You really paint this vivid picture of a man who's charismatic, who's manipulative, but kind of at the same time. Talk about those two traits and how that all played in this ability to seduce Navy officials so effectively.
So Leonard Francis is one of history's leading con men. He was a very, very smart businessman, but he did have this uncanny ability to charm and manipulate people, as you said. One Navy officer who I interviewed who had known Leonard Francis for a long time, for decades, said he compared him to a KGB officer, someone who was able to size people up and identify their weaknesses or personal foibles, and so he could figure out how to recruit or manipulate people. He was very good at bribing people in the Navy to do what he'd want. He essentially wanted people in the Navy to look the other way while he overcharged the Navy whenever a ship came into port and he provided services. He wanted to charge double or triple the amount he was allowed to. And he really had this old-fashioned scheme where he bribed and gave enough gifts to people, they would let him get away with it. And it worked for 25 years. But again, I think it kind of understates his psychological ability to size people up. And he was able to determine with pretty uncanny accuracy who would be willing to take a small bribe, who would then go for something more. He'd start out slow. He'd see who would be willing to take a Cuban cigar or a modest lunch, who was wanting more freebies. It's important to remember that under federal ethics rules, people in the Navy were only allowed to accept gifts from contractors worth $20 or less. So it's a pretty small limit, but Leonard would start small with a gift of maybe $50 or $60 and $100, and he'd slowly reel people in. And by the time they realized maybe it was too late, he had them over a barrel, and then he could order them to do what he wanted.
And these weren't easily duped people necessarily. These are some of the best and the brightest of our country, certainly in military men and women who are very intelligent people, yet he was able to lavish bribes and throw parties and really influence some of the upper ranks in the Navy. Give us an example of one of his lavish bribes or parties, one that just jumps out. I don't want to give too much away because the book is so excellent, but just whet our appetites a little bit with what he was actually doing to get these people hooked.
Yeah, so Leonard really knew how to exploit a military officer's sense of entitlement, particularly in the Navy when you had senior officers on a ship that had been at sea for weeks or months and they were coming into port, or admirals or commanding officers of the ship. He knew how to cater to them. He would provide for the ship captain a Mercedes and driver to transport them around port. He would then hold these lavish dinner parties, and lavish doesn't really begin to cut it. I'll give you one example. In Hong Kong, around Christmas time, and this was 20 years ago, 2004, the USS Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Strike Group was visiting Hong Kong, and Leonard decided to throw a party, and he invited the admiral in charge of the strike group and about 50 other officers to a party at a swanky hotel in Hong Kong with beautiful views of Victoria Harbor, and he spent $60,000 on this dinner party for about 50 people, so more than $1,000 a head. And these people would come in, and Leonard had Scottish bagpipers to greet them. He had these exquisite brands of brandy and cognac and Cristal champagne and a 7-course meal with foie gras and lobster thermidor. Essentially, he was giving them a taste of the high life that he knew was out of their reach in the military. But the coup de grace, as it were, that evening is he had brought in several scantily clad young women dressed as Santa's elves. He called them Santa Niñas or Santa girls, and they were there to mingle with the guests. And he made quite an impression. I mean, as you can imagine, a $60,000 dinner party with elves and bagpipers. But with Leonard Francis, he wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just charismatic. He was a showman. Everything with Leonard had to be over the top. He was trying to blow their minds with what he could offer in terms of gifts, but he also, again, wanted to show them a taste of the high life that he knew was unattainable to people in the military. And by providing that, they became beholden to him. People were happy to do him favors in return. This went on, again, for 20 years. And so anytime a Navy ship came through his part of the world in Southeast Asia, word spread, as you can imagine, pretty quickly that Leonard was there to show them a good time and give them gifts and experiences that they would never dream of doing back in the United States, where their bosses or people in Congress or family members were keeping an eye on them.
And I have to say, the pictures in the book are amazing too. And I laughed as you were talking about the bagpipers, because there's this great photo of the bagpipers of all things coming in to the party in the book that shows this wonderful photo. Lots of other great photos. Again, check this book out. Our guest today is Craig Whitlock, author of the wonderful book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Congrats again. The writing is fantastic. I just love the story. But I think what really always catches my attention too, Craig Whitlock, is the research. I like to see the facts. Maybe I'm a little nerdy that way, but I just have to hand it to you. Your research on this is just amazing. And you mentioned that you went through several terabytes, a lot of data that you found in your research. The endnotes alone, I think, are about 100 pages. So you talked to a lot of people, you researched, you used FOIA, you really pulled this together in a lot of directions. Give us a sense as to the amount of information that you had to sift through in order to tell this wonderful story.
It's a big story. Leonard's a big guy, but his story is really big too. I had written about 50 articles, news articles about this case as it unfolded for the Washington Post, but it was very difficult to get information. As you can imagine, the U.S. Navy was not exactly eager to talk about it. It was this really embarrassing black eye of a scandal for them that so many officers had been accused of bribery. The Justice Department was also prosecuting people, and it would file things in court, but it didn't like to comment beyond that. It didn't want to jeopardize any of its cases. It was very close to the vest when it came to information. But I'm an investigative reporter by trade, and I could just tell that the story was much bigger than anyone was letting on. And every time I wrote another article for the Post, I realized I was still just skimming the surface. I was still trying to understand just how many people in the Navy had gotten their hands dirty with Leonard Francis over the years. How high did it go? And it went very high. It went all the way to the top ranks of the Navy. So I had to sort of scrape and scratch and cajole and get information where I could. And I got court records from Malaysia and Australia and the Philippines and the United States. I was filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the Navy. The Navy finally got so sick of my public records request that a lawyer wrote me a letter telling me to cease and desist, that they weren't going to release any more information. They were trying to drag it out and run the clock out on my request because they didn't want the story to come to light. I interviewed more than 100 people on the record for this book, but the big break I had was a few years ago. I finally got some sources to give me the confidential law enforcement files, and this case had been under investigation for 10 years by the Naval Criminal Investigation Investigative Service, or NCIS, and another federal agency called the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, which most people haven't heard of, but it's a bunch of law enforcement agents who work at the Pentagon for the Defense Department Inspector General. And they had conducted thousands of interviews. They had recorded people with wiretaps. They had interrogated dozens of admirals and other senior officers. And Leonard Francis, after his arrest, he pleaded guilty. He cooperated with the Justice Department, and he turned over this whole trove of information that he had kept over the years in case he needed to blackmail people. So he had photographs, he had emails, he had dinner menus, he had all this dirt he had collected on U.S. Navy personnel, and he shared that with investigators. So after picking away at it for a number of years, I finally had this mother lode. I had the raw original case files, and that enabled me for the first time to really get my arms around the scope of this, how many people were investigated. And it turned out that nearly 1,000 people, most of them in the Navy, had been investigated in this case. And that included more than 90 admirals. And again, these interactions they had with Leonard Francis had occurred over 25 years. So it's a very big, sprawling, rollicking story, but it made me more and more fascinated with the basic question of how could this Malaysian guy, and frankly, using this big, overweight Malaysian high school dropout with a felony record, how could he have compromised so many admirals in the most powerful Navy in the world? And that, at its heart, is what this book and this story is about.
What's been the reaction within military and government circles to all of this? Because this is a big black eye, and just the sheer number of participants enlisted and officer level. I mean, this is a big group of people. And so I imagine the reactions have been pretty severe in some cases.
Well, I think the reaction has been twofold. On one hand, the official reaction from the Navy as an institution at the Pentagon and the leadership has been silence. I think, nobody's disputing any of the facts in the book, but it's this terrible embarrassment for the Navy. And the Navy had resisted my efforts to disclose what should have been public information about what happened to all these admirals who were swept up in the case. So they've been quiet. They just keep hoping that it'll pass by unnoticed as much as possible. But certainly the reaction since the book has come out from people in the military or veterans who are not directly involved in the case is one of real anger. They feel betrayed by these people who are senior officers in the Navy. They're shocked by the revelations of how people acted for year after year. There's real disappointment with the Navy leadership when Leonard Francis was ruling the roost as a criminal, that they feel betrayed by this, and they don't understand how people who were held in high regard in leadership positions could have allowed this to persist for as long as it did.
You write about tailhook a little bit, and then here we've got another major scandal in the Navy, and you note throughout that admirals, top brass, they were let off pretty lightly. What does all this say about accountability in some of the high places, and how does this impact changes in policy now going forward in terms of best practices and naval work, especially in some of these cases where we've got this interesting term that you use, husbandry, going on in these ports?
It doesn't say much about accountability in the Navy's commitment to hold its leaders accountable. And there's a real paradox here that the Navy in particular has a tradition of holding its senior officers and commanding officers accountable for all actions that happen on their watch. This goes back hundreds of years. The Navy would invest an incredible amount of authority in its ship captains because they were, of course, far from headquarters, far from home on missions that would last for weeks or months without contact with home base. And so the ship captains and commanding officers and admirals had incredible amount of authority to do as they saw fit. But the Navy in turn would hold them accountable. If it's sort of a famous story in the Navy. If you're a ship captain and your ship runs aground or it hits something at sea, even if it was the fault of an enlisted sailor who screwed up, even if the ship captain wasn't on watch or was off the ship, they're still held accountable by the Navy under the theory that you're responsible for training everyone on the crew to make sure they know what their job is. So if somebody screws up and a ship gets damaged or something goes wrong, you hold the captain accountable. And yet the complete opposite happened in this corruption scandal with Fat Leonard. The people who were in charge of the Navy, particularly in Asia in the 7th Fleet, where Leonard Francis serviced U.S. Navy ships for 25 years, those people were not held held accountable. And I think that, in fact, informed the Navy's response, that they knew that if they started to hold senior officers accountable in this case, that there would be so many people who would get in trouble that really could paralyze the whole upper ranks of the Navy. So I think there was a recognition that if they started dropping the hammer on people, who knows how high it would lead. It's important to recognize that some of the admirals who came under investigation for accepting lavish meals or other gifts from Leonard, this did go all the way to the top of the chain of command. There were two chiefs of naval operations, and that's the highest ranking job in the Navy, who were investigated. The director of Navy intelligence was investigated. The superintendent of the Naval Academy in Annapolis. The commander of all U.S. military forces in Asia and the Pacific was investigated. So this went all the way to the top. Most of those people were let off with a slap on the wrist or were cleared in the end by Navy disciplinary authorities. There was only one admiral who went to jail. He served 18 months in prison for lying to federal investigators. So of the 90 admirals, only one did prison time. And I think that really sums up what happened with the senior leadership. They were given a pass.
Let's talk about that admiral. I think what you're referring to is Admiral Robert Gilbo, perhaps Crazy Bob, you refer to him in the book. And you also refer to NCIS, and there's John Billiveau, who was an NCIS agent who was turned. But I think I'd like to ask you to maybe describe Crazy Bob. And then the other very sad character, at least in my mind, sad in the sense that there's so much potential, was Mike Misowitz. Maybe tell us a little bit about those two. And then I'm going to ask you to read a brief passage, Craig Whitlock, and maybe you'll set that passage up for us a little bit too.
Sure. So Crazy Bob was a nickname for an admiral named Robert Gilbo, and he had been a friend of Leonard Francis for a good 20 years. He had met him when he was a supply officer on a ship called the USS Boxer during a port visit to Bali, Indonesia in the Navy, and they got along great. Gilbo was known as a really smart, clever graduate of the Naval Academy. He was a supply officer, so his job was to make sure the ship had all the food, water, equipment, weapons, whatever it needed in terms of supply. So he had to deal directly with Leonard Francis quite a bit. But they had a fun side. They liked to party. They liked to party with women. And Leonard found Gilbo to be someone who would sign his invoices no matter what he was charging. So Leonard alleged to federal officials that he had actually given $40,000 in cash bribes to Gilbo at one point to approve overcharges for sewage invoices during port visits in Asia. But the story really takes an incredible turn shortly after Leonard Francis is arrested in San Diego in 2013 in a sting operation involving federal agents. Word starts to spread very, very quickly through the Navy worldwide that Fat Leonard has been arrested, and a lot of people who had taken his bribes or gifts over the years got very worried that they were going to get swept up in this case, that they were going to come under investigation. And at this point, Bob Gilbo is an admiral, a one-star admiral serving in Kabul, Afghanistan, of all places. He's in charge of a logistics unit in the war zone that's starting to withdraw U.S. military equipment. Gilbo at that point starts to have a mental breakdown, and his staff starts to get very worried about his health and welfare, and at one point had to confront him and ask him to hand over his military sidearm, his pistol, because Gilbo was acting so crazy. By Gilbo's own descriptions, he would stay up all night watching strange videos. There was a show on HBO called Californication that he would watch. He was not paying attention to his job. He talked about seeing little blue men in little blue suits in his bathroom. He was acting like he was losing it. The problem was, a lot of his staffers thought he was faking the whole thing just to avoid being prosecuted in the Fat Leonard case. And so it's one of these stories that's almost too strange to be true, but I managed to get the interrogation transcripts when federal agents interrogated Gilbo shortly after he was medevaced out of Afghanistan, ostensibly for having PTSD and a mental breakdown. And it's just this bizarre interrogation where Gilbo claims that he has PTSD, and in his own words, he claims to be going crazy. But yet the investigators and Gilbo's own staff in the war zone had suspected him of faking this whole thing just to get out of trouble because of his past with Leonard Francis. In the end, he ends up pleading guilty to lying to federal agents and gets an 18-month prison term. But it's just one of these stories that you can't make up, to have an admiral fake going crazy in a war zone to get out of getting in trouble because of his past hijinks with Leonard Francis. That kind of summed up for me this whole story, this whole book was just the twists and turns are really unbelievable. You can't make this stuff up.
You just can't. Tell a little bit about Mike Misowitz, because that was a sad one in all of this. So much potential for a man who was an immigrant to our country. Lots of great things. The Navy really built him up, and then he fell and fell hard.
It is. It's a real tragic story. And it's a Navy officer named Michael Misowitz. And he's got a Polish-American last name, but that kind of obscures his origins. He actually was born in Cambodia. And at a young age, he was evacuated from Cambodia by an American service member, a woman, Marina Misowitz. And she had worked for the Army and the U.S. Embassy in Cambodia and had become friendly with this child who the Americans called Mikey, like Mikey Likes It on Life cereal ads. And his family, Misowitz's family, was worried about the Khmer Rouge. People could see the writing on the wall that there was this communist insurgency, was very extraordinarily brutal. They were closing in on the capital. And so Mikey's family begged this American servicewoman to adopt him and take him to the United States. And she was very torn because she, of course, didn't want to take him away from his family, but his family was begging her to do it. So she did. And she moved back to her hometown in farm country in Illinois and gave this young Cambodian kid her last name. And his name became Michael Misowitz. And he grew up in the cornfields in Illinois. And he ended up thriving there. He got a commission to the U.S. Naval Academy, became an officer, and his career reached an apex in the early 2000s when he became the commanding officer of a U.S. warship, guided missile destroyer, and made a triumphant return to Cambodia, the country of his birth, as a captain of this warship. And this was a story that was really played up by the U.S. Navy as an example of something that could only happen in America, where an immigrant could flee genocide, come to the United States as a child, go to the Naval Academy, become a highly respected officer and command a powerful warship like that and come back to his home country in the name of freedom. It was a real feel-good story for the Navy. And no question that Mike Misowitz was an officer on the rise, that people said it was only a matter of time before he became an admiral. But right around the time that Michael Misowitz made this return visit to Cambodia, he had become friends with, you guessed it, Leonard Francis, Fat Leonard. And Fat Leonard noticed, the sly, cunning guy that he was, he noticed some weaknesses and vulnerabilities in Misowitz's personality. Misowitz was married with a few kids, but his marriage was falling apart. He kind of had money problems. He was susceptible to drinking and prostitutes. And Leonard, of course, saw an opportunity here and took full advantage and became Misowitz's friend. And the bribes started flowing. And Misowitz then took an important job on the staff of the U.S. 7th Fleet, where he oversaw all maritime operations throughout the Asia Pacific. And this was a position that was really important for Leonard Francis, because then he could essentially influence the movement of U.S. ships throughout the region. He would say, no, don't send that aircraft carrier to Singapore, send it to Thailand or Malaysia instead, because that'll be easier for me to overcharge the Navy in those ports. And Misowitz would lobby on Leonard's behalf. He also leaked him classified information. And again, to give you a sense of what a betrayal that is, for a U.S. military officer to leak classified information to a foreign citizen who doesn't have any clearance to have that information is seen as such a traitorous act. And yet Misowitz did this despite his upbringing, despite the fact that he was the golden boy of the U.S. Navy in the 7th Fleet. Leonard Francis had control of him, and he was arrested and spent several years in prison. So this is a tragic story, but it just goes to show that Leonard Francis, he wasn't just corrupting or bribing ne'er-do-wells in the Navy or officers who were disgruntled. He was going after the best and brightest, and Misowitz is a perfect example of that.
Thanks again for this wonderful work. Congratulations. Craig Whitlock, investigative journalist, has just written a well-reported book titled Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Check it out. I know our audience is just going to enjoy this immensely. I did. I hope as you do additional work either on this subject or others, you'll come back. I really would love it. I know our audience will. And I have to tell you, I hope Fat Leonard makes it to film or to an extended series on streaming somewhere where this story can be told in an additional way, because it is just wonderful. I think it lends itself so much to that too. But congrats to you and your family, because I know it takes a lot of work for everybody to pull this off. So congratulations, Craig Whitlock. And thanks so much for your generous time today. I've just enjoyed it immensely.
Me too, Paul. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great story. I always love talking about it. And again, Leonard Francis is one of those characters you never come across. Just a quick story. You mentioned a movie. Nobody would like a movie more than Leonard Francis. In fact, he's talked about this for years. He's already picked out who he wants to play him. He's decided that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the former professional wrestler, should play him on the screen. I don't think that's going to happen, but it gives you an idea of Leonard's ego and how he sees himself.
That is wonderful. That's so great. Okay, Craig Whitlock, we're going to let you go. I could talk to you for a lot longer, but this has just been a marvelous conversation. Again, congrats on all that you're doing, and my best to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com, or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. My thanks to newspapers.com for bringing you today's episode so generously. Please support our sponsors. Check out newspapers.com. Find out all the details in our show notes today. But my thanks as well to best-selling author Craig Whitlock in this wonderful new book that he has written titled Fat Leonard: How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Thanks, Craig, for joining us today so generously, as well as reading and all of your research for this wonderful book. My thanks to Sam Henniger, our executive producer, for all he does to support the show. My thanks as well to all of you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and remember, let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.